Yeah, I guess I'll play out Hero of Bladehold, and hope you don't have a board wipe. Fingers crossed for no sweepers. Please don't have a board clear. Hope one of those cards in your hand isn't a Wrath. No board sweep one time? You better not wog me. Don't wog me, bro. In that case, let's just break on into a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, going fully unapologetically Grinch this year, Maddox.
100% completely Grinch, no exceptions, no Christmas.
Full Grinch mode? Full Grinch mode when?
Full Grinch mode.
Do you want to share why you're going full Grinch mode?
No,
or?
Not really.
Okay, just a you thing. Now, what does this mean? You won't be celebrating any Christmas. There'll be no decorations. There'll be no joy.
Uh-huh.
Are you going to work on the 25th of December?
No, of course not. That's ridiculous. It's a holiday.
What holiday is it, though?
Christmas.
So he admitted it exists.
Yeah.
Okay, you're over Christmas.
Great.
That's all there is to it. That means we can just get right into the topic on this episode, which is board wipes, Anthony. You know, we're 230 whatever episodes in, and still there are like very basic episode concepts we have not addressed, and I feel like one of them is just talking about board wipes.
Speaking of the Grinch, what if we destroy everything?
Sure. But I think it's interesting to talk about. I mean, we'll have our classic pedantic discussion we have whenever we do one of these episodes, which is what is a board wipe?
No, we couldn't possibly have a pedantic discussion.
I think it's important to have that discussion because it's like performance art to demonstrate how difficult it is to put anything into rigid boxes in this game.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about what a board wipe is. We'll talk about what isn't a board wipe that might be board wipe adjacent. But then I think we should mostly spend our time talking about how a cube designer ought to think about what kinds and how many board wipes to include in their own cube list and what effects those might have on the play patterns of their environment.
Sounds like a plan.
New topics, Anthony. They're still out there. There are still things we haven't talked about when it comes to cube, miraculously somehow. Let's just start at the top then. What's a board wipe, Anthony?
I would say that a board wipe is a card that destroys all creatures. And I want to say that that is not a definitive definition. That is a tent post definition, and there are lots of variations to the large circus of board wipes. That is a tent with many posts.
The definition I came up with is a symmetrical effect that removes most or all of the relevant permanents from play. The caveat there being that in most cubes, the most relevant permanent type is going to be creatures. But, you know, if you have an artifact cube, I would certainly consider Meltdown a board wipe in that cube, right? If you've got tons of artifacts running around, then something that destroys all artifacts, I think very much fits the same play patterns and should be thought of in the same way as you would think of, you know, a Wrath of God in a regular cube.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, just the thing that symmetrically resets all of the threats, whatever those threats are, is like a particular card that allows you to build around it in a way that relies on gaining card advantage from being able to destroy everything and not necessarily just trying to build up your own resources as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think the fuzzier answer is just the thing that resets the state of the board. So return things to the starting point to some degree. So in terms of things that aren't board wipes, I think there are some cards that can effectively do this, but are much too costly or impractical to accomplish this, where it's like, all right, technically, this card can destroy all creatures, but realistically, it's not actually going to most of the time. Or cards that are not actually symmetrical, like, you know, Settle the Wreckage is a card I think a lot of people think of as a board wipe, and in some senses it is, but I think the considerations around what sort of deck you draft to build Settle the Wreckage into and what sort of cube you put Settle the Wreckage into are very different considerations than the cube and deck you put Wrath of God in. So for that reason, I would argue that things like Settle the Wreckage being non-symmetrical shouldn't really be part of this conversation.
Interesting. I feel like in a lot of environments, Settle the Wreckage and Wrath of God do perform a similar role, but I think we can get deeper into the weeds as we go along.
Well, we're going to, because there's some cards in our respective cubes that sometimes are more Settle the Wreckage-y than they are Wrath of God-y, and that's just going to again, get to the nuance of this discussion in detail. I went through and did my little number crunch, very basic number crunch on my primary cube, the Bun Magic Cube, which is a Eternal cube, powerful cards, a lot of iconic things you would find in a vintage cube, but it's my own take on it where everything is very low curving and extremely interactive. I also did this for your regular cube, Anthony, which is your sort of master set level environment, which is designed around good, strong clean Magic as you see it. So, think something kind of like a peasant cube, but with rares where rares are appropriate. And then I also did it for my neoclassical cube, which is the last one of our cubes that I think is even close to normal enough for this sort of analysis to be relevant to a lot of listeners. So
no clown shoes cubes today, is that what you're saying?
We could talk about the density of board wipes in the Turbo Cube or the 100 Ornithopters Cube, but I really doubt that information is going to be relevant to the cube designers listening to this in terms of informing their own cube design decisions. So didn't bother tallying up the numbers there.
Do you want to move off of what is a board wipe, though? Because I feel like there's a couple other questions I have about what qualifies.
I don't, but I only brought up the cubes that I crunched these numbers on because I also include some examples from these cubes that could be seen maybe as a board wipe in some people's eyes that I am not classifying as board wipe. So in the Bun Magic Cube, the best example of this is like Walking Ballista, where not only is that asymmetrical, but it's also mana-intensive-wise impractical to consider it a Plague Wind, right? Like, you're not going to, in the vast majority of game states, have enough mana in that cube to realistically just keep your opponent's board clear with Walking Ballista. In the regular cube, I didn't count things like Archfiend of Ifnir as a board wipe because, once again, not symmetrical. That one also requires a little bit of work to actually, remove your opponent's creatures. Nor something like Priest of the Forgotten Gods, right? That's a card that can theoretically remove an unbounded number of creatures from play of your opponents, but requires you keep feeding it stuff and also requires a lot of time. And so if it's something that takes a long time for the effect to take place, I also would not consider it a board wipe. Then in the Neoclassical Cube, Masticore is just the Neoclassical Walking Ballista, not a board wipe. Also, Visar the Dreadful and Phyrexian Plague Lord, two things that can also remove creatures over time, not going to be a board wipe because they are asymmetrical and also take a long time for the effect to take place. So
yeah, I mean, if this is a long spectrum of what qualifies as a board wipe, I think those are very comfortably at the very far end. Like destroying one creature a turn, very different from destroy all creatures.
Yep, I agree. So you said you have more questions about sort of boxing in this definition.
So different colors will destroy all creatures or destroy all things in different ways. Like Wrath of God is the classic, just destroy all creatures. I wish it was a little bit more classic. It's also got the can't be regenerated. We're stuck with that.
Day of Judgment is
the
classic.
Day of Judgment is the classic. Destroy all creatures. But, in red, we see board wipe type things that are damage based. So what do you think about Pyroclasm, which just does 2 damage to all creatures?
Well, I have separated all the board wipes into what I'm calling hard board wipes and what I'm calling soft board wipes. And soft is something that is going to remove a subset of creatures symmetrically, like your Pyroclasms. Or to use examples that are actually in the cubes we're talking about, you have Drown in Sorrow and Plague Spitter in your cube. I'm counting those as soft board wipes. In mine, I have the Meathook Massacre, Harvester of Misery, even Engineered Explosives I'm counting as a soft board wipe. It's going to remove a subset of things, but it's going to do it indiscriminately, regardless of who controls them, and just symmetrically across the board.
I think that makes sense. So, dealing a certain amount of damage, or, where do you put Toxic Deluge, which does -X to everything? Or,
I have that one in
Black Sun Zenith. It's like Black Sun Zenith maybe is on the softer side because it's harder to definitely kill everything.
Yeah, just another great example of how all these categories and labels are so hard to define, because practically, I think Toxic Deluge pretty often plays as a full board wipe, as in, you will have committed no creatures to the board, or, a Baleful Strix, something that already got you some value and you're willing to sacrifice, and your opponent will have a full board, and you'll just pay however much life you need to kill everything. But in Deluge's case, sometimes you don't have enough life to pay because your opponent has some big threat out and it's late in the game and your life total's low. Or sometimes, you've built a deck where you have a lot of high toughness creatures and your opponent has a lot of low toughness creatures, and you can kind of turn it into an asymmetrical effect. So I've counted Deluge as a soft board wipe, but that one has, much closer to the hard board wipe category than, something like Black Sun Zenith or the Meathook Massacre, where you need quite a bit of mana to actually do the same symmetrical toughness reduction you get from Toxic Deluge.
Sure. And what about the sort of much more conditional things, like something like Extinction Event, which is just destroy either all odd or all even creatures, where, you can kind of just build around this in a different way and try and get only even creatures in the board to destroy all your opponent's odd mana value creatures, or something like that. But also sometimes it just is a board wipe, or sometimes it just doesn't really work.
I definitely would have counted that as a soft board wipe, but you did cut that from regular cube, right?
I did, yeah.
So how do we categorize that specific one is a theory discussion. I would have categorized that as a soft board wipe if prompted. Because again, indiscriminate, but not removing everything.
Sure, or like a card that I saw in play last night, Crux of Fate, which is either destroy all dragon creatures, destroy all non-dragon creatures. Some of these things, I feel like there's like a spectrum of how hard of a board wipe it is. There's also the spectrum, or not the spectrum, the added spice of what is the theme of this set that this board wipe is being printed in.
It's entirely dependent on context, right? You can't just say that Crux of Fate is a hard board wipe, because in certain cubes where everybody's got some dragons in their deck. It's just not. So all these things are context dependent, and I looked at them in what my perception is the context of the environments in question.
Sure. Another one that's a little bit weird that is in my cube is by invitation only, which you choose a number and sacrifice that many. Each player sacrifices that many creatures, up to 13, again, kind of for flavor reasons for the set it was printed in. And that one is like, I feel like it's usually a board wipe, but also has the modality of, oh, you have 3 creatures, I have 6, and I would like you to sacrifice your 3 creatures so I can get through and deal lethal. So, I mean, where does that modality affect how you think about them?
That's one of the hardest ones to slot in here because it can play both roles, and I think it plays that second role often enough that that's a board wipe that actually I think does not follow the rules of what kind of decks you can or should include it in, which in some senses means that maybe it shouldn't be counted as a board wipe for the purposes of this discussion. I did count it as a board wipe because, well, there's kind of 2 questions for this discussion, right? There's questions around like how many board wipes ought you include in your cube and what does that do to the play patterns of the environment. And there's another question, which is like, what sort of decks do you want to include board wipes in and why? And I think by invitation only very much counts as a board wipe for the purposes of like, how many board wipes are in the regular cube? Should I worry about overcommitting to the board? Like these kinds of questions. But it very much is not a board wipe with regards to what sorts of decks want board wipes. Well, I think you can and should put by invitation only in pretty much any white deck in the regular cube, even a white deck that is chock-a-block full of creatures, because maybe you have it in your opening hand, you just sandbag it a little bit and you treat it like a full board wipe. Or maybe, you're in a board stall, but you have a few more creatures and you can just break that parity and keep just your best creatures in play, make your opponent sacrifice their whole board, which plays like a big eliminate the competition, which is another one that I have as a weirdo. I counted that one as a weirdo. There are 2 cards.
I think that's a great language to introduce to talking about Magic the Gathering. It's like, we want to put things into hard categories, but
you got Baneslayers, Muldrifters, and weirdos.
in a good way, in an affectionate way. We want to call some of these cards weirdos.
We love weirdos here for sure. I have 2 cards across all 3 cubes that are in the weirdos category, which I didn't actually count towards the total, but I mentioned, and eliminate the competition is one of them. The other one is humility in the neoclassical cube.
That's a weirdo.
It's a weirdo. It's definitely going to neutralize most or all of the creatures on the board, but very often the decks with humility win with humility in play by making a bunch of creatures. Like it is still possible. So
yes, the more worse creatures you have with humility, the better off you are.
Well, it depends on the kind of creatures you have, right? You want creature tokens. You want like mobilization, decree of justice. And you want to spend as little mana and cards making individual creatures as possible, and then you want your opponents just to be playing creature spells and spending 4 mana on a 1/1.
Yeah, it is amazing how much the modality of Wraths really, really affects sort of the structure of how you're playing them, because Wrath of God is extremely committal, because if you're head on board, it's just a card that you really don't want to play at all.
Yeah, it's a dead card
if
you
dead card.
Have more or better creatures than your opponent.
So then comparing that to something that has the second mode of like, what if it's Wrath of God or, make a 4/4. It's like, great, when I'm ahead, I'll make the 4/4. When I'm behind, I'll cast Wrath of God. That just ends up being a card that you're very happy to put into any deck. And that means it loses a lot of that strategic depth, which I find less appealing. And we've talked a lot about sort of modal cards that have very, very broad use cases. Like it makes the cards much more powerful because they're good in multiple game states, but it does make them less committal, which I think is often less interesting to draft with.
You're a by invitation only enjoyer.
I put that one in with a lot of skepticism, and it's been fine. I don't know. It's like not every card can be
meet all of your goals.
Meet all of your goals, 100%. So, I mean, that card's just been kind of fun to draft sometimes. But, I mean, another card that comes to mind is Fiery Confluence, which sometimes can be a Wrath, but often is just destroy your opponent. And you might just be putting it into your deck for one reason or the other, but then these use cases come up that you want to do something different with a card, which, I mean, is a counterpoint to what I just said. Like, I do like that aspect when it's like, here, we're going to give you a little bit of modality, which makes you more excited to put a card into your deck, and then 20% of the time it does the unexpected thing, and that wouldn't have happened if you didn't have the modality, because you just wouldn't put it in the deck. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's why I like by invitation only a little bit, that it has a kind of modality that means people are actually willing to put a Wrath in, whereas otherwise people will be pretty unlikely to in the regular cube specifically.
Yeah, we can have this conversation now, I guess, because I'm a classic by invitation only detractor. And the reason is because of the complete lack of like deck building restrictions. Board wipes are, I think, inherently some of the most powerful cards in any cube that they're in, just in terms of like effect on the game, right? Like,
sure, yeah.
We talk about the value of a 2-for-1 or like, God forbid, a 3-for-1, but it's not uncommon for board wipes to be a 4 or 5 or 6-for-1, right? Your opponent's got a full board, you just blow it all up. And there's very few cards that can possibly be that swingy, right? Under any circumstances. And so the play pattern specifically that really ticks me off about by invitation only is that one where I've jammed it in my creature deck, but I just have it in my opening hand. And so I'm just going to like play out a Elvish Visionary or something to bait you into thinking that I just drew badly and don't have any creatures to curve out with. And then
so there's like, oh, what a bad hand. Oh, maybe I should have get this.
I'm getting flooded. And then just
don't do that.
And then you just get to, free roll this incredibly powerful swingy effect where you just completely destroy your opponent's board at no cost to you in a deck that otherwise, if you had Wrath of God in that deck, it would be a huge risk because it would be a dead draw much of the time. So for that reason, on this particular card type, I do find the really modal ones to be not to my taste. I like when you have to work for it in deck building and sequencing.
You mentioned Meathook Massacre. Do you not also count that as a pretty modal card? Because sometimes you do want to just cast this for 2, destroy nothing, and then just get the static effect.
Yeah, but it's never going to be as swingy. Like, I think if you drafted a deck where you're mostly casting Meathook Massacre for 2, which I should note really isn't happening in the Bun Magic cube. I think it probably happens a lot more in cubes that support like an Aristocrats theme, but I don't have a lot of token producers and like ways to sacrifice creatures. Like, it's just not really what my cube is all about. So I think in the cube where you do have that sort of theme, your deck that is going to play it on 2 probably is planning to do that most of the time. And yeah, I guess in that situation you could have the same sort of negative play pattern I'm describing where I have Meathook Master in my opening hand. Usually I just play it on 2 as another Blood Artist effect that's harder to interact with. But now I'm just going to sandbag a little bit and then sort of blow my opponent out. Though I will add, if your opponent just curves out, certainly in the Bun Magic cube, the Meathook Massacre is not going to on curve destroy all the things. It's X black for -X. So you got to get to 3 mana before you're destroying even 1 toughness things.
Sure.
By the time your opponent's on 3 mana in my cube, you're likely on 4 toughness things in most colors.
Okay, one more. What about Upheaval or other like mass bounce effects? Do you put these in kind of the same space?
Absolutely, I do,
okay.
Yeah. I think Upheaval is very much a board wipe. I think a hard one, honestly. I mean, it has the caveat of essentially drawing your opponent a bunch of cards, those cards being the ones that you just destroyed in big air quotes. But the thoroughness of how much it resets the board, I think very much counts it as a hard board wipe for me.
All right, let's get a little bit weirder, because I actually just scrolled through all the cards that are tagged on Scryfall as sweepers, and it is like a very broad category. There's definitely a lot of things here that I, would put on that far end of the spectrum that don't really seem like board wipes. But what about something like Armageddon? Not destroying the threats, but it is destroying all lands symmetrically.
Yeah, to me, I think that's just a whole different category of cards. Unless you have a desert cube, or like if you have a lands matter cube where like the vast majority of your threats are creature lands, and there you have Armageddons. Like,
now that's an interesting cube.
I mean, it could be.
It's kind of like all your creatures just have upkeep 4 or whatever.
Yeah, which I've definitely seen either all land or very, very heavily land cubes, like cubes where 80% of the cards are land.
We're getting a little clown shoes here.
It's definitely closer to the clown shoes end of the spectrum. But I think there you could argue that Armageddon plays similar to Wrath of God, but in a typical cube, I think resource denial is very different from resetting the board with regards to threats and the clock.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I got one more at least. What about balance?
I have that in the soft board wipe category, and like Toxic Deluge, I think is a little closer to the hard board wipe category in that most of the ways you will abuse balance is you will put it in a deck that has very few creatures, and ideally enchantments, planeswalkers, and artifacts, other cards that are not counted as the permanents in the balance equation, which means you can get a big sort of swinging card advantage and also board presence by casting balance. But
so this is both to you, like, worth considering a board wipe, both because it can be in a very functional sense, but also it kind of plays the same way in terms of how it pushes your deck building to be really around this card.
Yeah, like balance is not like by invitation only where I'm just jamming it in any deck because maybe it's good. Because it's not good very much of the time if you are ahead on board in terms of creatures. So yeah, it's a build around soft board wipe to me that is on that sort of cusp of being a hard board wipe in the right deck. That's, again, all context dependent, right? Like, I think, for example, balance is in 100 Ornithopters, and I think there it is further from a hard board wipe, because there I think you want to play in a deck where you're going big, you have fewer Ornithopters that have more power and toughness versus going wide, and I think you will often play it while you have a couple Ornithopters in play. It's just that your Ornithopters are very powerful and your opponents are throwaway 0/2s. And
it's starting to sound a little bit like by invitation only in this context.
In the 100 Ornithopters is much closer to it, I think, yeah. But again, that's a whole different cube with very different considerations, which is why I don't think it's super relevant to the discussion.
Fair enough.
We'll get to the actual density of board wipes we run in each of our respective cubes. First, I want to talk about cost, because the actual impetus for this episode is that we were in Richmond this past weekend playing some Cube with our buddies, and Justin Parnell. Justin Parnell is a friend of ours and was along for the ride. And Justin has brought his cube, which is a cube that neither of us have actually played before. Justin, famous for not bringing his cube to events, just being very happy to queue in with other people and draft whatever's on offer.
It's a good strategy, to be honest.
Yeah, I respect it deeply, and it also, makes things go easier when everyone shows up and wants their cube to be drafted. Justin's not thirsty. He's happy to play whatever's on tap. But Justin brought his cube along. We ended up playing it and talking about it at length. And Justin's cube is I would say, a very powerful vintage cube. It's not a powered vintage cube, but it does have lots of cards that are banned in Legacy. I would call it an eternal cube. That's the language I prefer. It's got many of the most powerful cards from Magic's history in it. There are cards that Justin has excluded for being too powerful. Justin's not all about that Sheoldred Life or Uro. But
Honestly, I respect those choices too.
Sure, but there are, Lelia and Fable of the Mirror Breaker and what's the Phoenix, the 5? Athari. That one's kind of nuts. There's a lot of really powerful cards there. But one thing that Justin noted in discussing the cube beforehand was that he has no board wipes until you get to 5 mana, which I thought was really interesting, because I think historically I have thought of the cost of board wipes as being kind of directly correlated with the power of the environment, right? Like if you're playing at the peaks of power level, yeah, give your players 4 mana hard board wipes, maybe even give them balances and toxic deluges, things that can be hard board wipes at lower mana costs. And the regular cube, 5 mana has been the bar for board wipes for a long time. Right now you have ones that can be more expensive with like modal costs, but there's nothing below 5 mana that's a hard board wipe in the regular cube, which I think you made that decision basically because you felt that 4 mana would be too powerful for a board wipe effect, a hard board wipe in that environment.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, when I started designing this cube, it was largely, honestly, in sort of comparison to your cube, and I kind of wanted to create something that was different, played a little bit closer to retail limited, and I kind of started with the sort of naive approach of, let's take a lot of the basic effects and add 1 mana to it. So, Wraths cost 5 instead of 4, Mana Dorks cost 2 instead of 1, and that ended up not playing out perfectly. Like, we've iterated on and evolved the cube a lot, and it turns out, like, 2 Mana Dorks are so much worse than 1 Mana Dorks, whereas 5 Mana Wrath is a little bit worse than our 4 Mana Wrath. And I feel like that scaling of the Wraths worked pretty well, whereas the scaling of the Mana Dorks didn't work so well, and we ended up sort of just like reshaping what Green's identity is in large parts anyway, so there aren't really Mana Dorks anymore, but I think that sort of theory still applies, that like everything is scaled up, but then we had to apply some nuance to it with some playtesting.
Yeah, I think as a classic thing that a lot of cube designers do, where it's like, 1 mana difference, but 1 and 2 mana is a 50% jump or 100% jump in the cost of the mana, whereas 4 to 5 is only a 25% jump. So the relative costs are definitely way different there. I don't even think it has to do with the nature of the effect. I think it has to do with what 1 mana means low on the curve versus high on the curve. Let's just kind of work our way down. What to you are the hallmarks of an environment where the board wipes start at 5 mana?
I think it is going to be difficult to pin that down. I mean, another thing about the regular cube, since we're talking about that, is I did want to emulate kind of the play of limited Magic, where the focus is about playing to the board, and it's about creatures and combat, and so in addition to wanting to sort of scale everything, I specifically didn't want board wipes to be a huge thing, so there are only a couple. I think there's 3 of those like classic 5 mana destroy all creatures effects, and I think they're currently not super powerful and don't see a lot of play. So, I mean, looking at this environment, I would just not necessarily make it a focus of evaluating the environment at all.
But you would definitely draft differently if you were in blue-white and knew you would have access to 5 mana Wraths versus wouldn't. Or do you saying you genuinely wouldn't? Do you draft the same kind of deck here if there were no 5 mana board wipes in this cube?
No, I guess I would say that if I knew there were 4 mana board wipes, I would be more interested in drafting, big stuff and getting to the late game and being able to have like really good tools against aggressive decks, and also maybe looking for non-creatures that I could play that would generate value over time. I think all of those would, they'd just be powered up if the board wipes are more efficient.
But that's not what I'm asking, though. I'm just saying, forget more efficient board wipes. I'm saying, what do you do as a drafter and a player in an environment where there are 5 mana board wipes?
I cross my fingers and hope my opponent doesn't have them.
Is that true? You basically think that at 5 mana, they are not worth playing around. Your opponent's played nothing on their turn 4. They've just gone land.
Yeah,
land.
I mean, I guess that's actually a really good point. It's much harder at 5 mana to bluff I just don't have anything. So you have more time to notice that your opponent is kind of slow rolling their creatures.
Is that actually true?
I don't know.
Because
that's my theory.
I think my read of the situation is that you're moving the board wipes up a mana in the regular cube relative to the Bun Magic cube was basically because by turn 5, a good aggressive deck in the regular cube can expect to have done as much damage as a good aggressive deck in the Bun Magic cube could expect to have done by turn 4.
Sure, in very rough strokes, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's roughly true. In which case, do you measure that time in turns or do you measure that time in clock, right? I imagine both of those board wipes are coming down, a turn or two before you would just be dead if you did nothing in those environments. So to me, it feels like they kind of come down at the same moment and there's not any additional time to evaluate whether or not your opponent might be sandbagging a board wipe.
Sure. I see what you're saying.
I play around them the same in both environments, I guess is what I'm saying. As a player, now I will say that in the regular cube, all the board wipes are in white. And so if I'm not playing against white, I will not worry about overcommitting to the board. I will just keep pressing in my advantage and keep curving out, because the only things that are going to remove stuff in other colors are conditional or things that I wouldn't be able to predict or play around necessarily. I'm not going to play around Witch's Vengeance, right? I'm just going to keep curving out and try to put as much pressure on as I can. Maybe I'd play around Witch's Vengeance if I could in the second or third game once I saw it in your deck, but that's not the same as playing against a blue-white deck that had a couple counterspells. There, I'm going to be very conscious of the fact that they might have a 5-mana board wipe, and I don't want to be stuck with 1 card in hand to their 4 after that board wipe resolves. I also do draft very differently if I get them, and I don't agree necessarily that these board wipes are not strong in the regular cube currently.
Yeah, actually, I honestly don't have a great sense of it. I feel like they just don't get played that often, but I think that might just be largely to the biases of the players. Just 2 weeks ago when we last played this cube, somebody who was brand new to it actually drafted a really powerful Jeskai deck that was playing a bunch of these board wipes, and, also had the Spells Matter strategy, so they were really quickly able to cast a bunch of stuff after a board wipe and kill their opponent very quickly. So it's definitely possible, but it's definitely an area also that I feel like as a player, I'm not super comfortable and skilled at playing with or around board wipes.
This is an interesting question of perception, because my read of the situation is that I actually think over the past 12 months, blue-white control specifically has been a strong overperformer in our local meta, and largely because of the power of by invitation only, which I think maybe you're looking at the CubeCon data, which is the most recent objective data set that is free of our meta, and there some of the old assumptions about this cube are ringing true, but we have to go through and do a analysis of all the deck pictures in the Discord channel. But why, hello, past Andy. It's me, future Andy, having done said analysis. I did go through the deck pictures in the regular cube channel just because I was curious for my own benefit. I wanted to know what these numbers actually looked like. This is from the last 12 months with a couple big caveats. One, not everybody posts a deck picture, so I definitely don't have complete deck pictures and lists from the past 12 months of the regular cube. The other big caveat is that the cube is bigger than 360 cards, so we're only drafting a portion of it each time, and it means that control does not show up in every draft of the cube. Oftentimes, blue-white is doing something else, or white is being splashed in somebody's Esper deck that's more of a tempo deck that doesn't have anything resembling board wipes. It's got a lot of cheap creatures, so everything's kind of fuzzy here. But in my analysis, I have 6 3-0 decks, and they were green-white splashing black, but that one did have by invitation only. A blue-black control deck splashing white, but it had none of the Wraths. Green-red aggro, 2 black-red sack decks, and 1 committed blue-white control deck that had by invitation only. Then I looked at all the records of what I would call the blue-white control archetype, and again, this is editorialized by me looking at somebody's blue-white deck that is more like a ninjutsu tempo deck and saying this is not even trying to be a control deck. And the records were 1-3-0, the one I already mentioned, and 3-2-1s. And every single one of those decks had board wipes. The one that doesn't have by invitation only had both route and planar outburst. 2 had just by invitation only, and 1 had by invitation only and route. Again, this is a limited data set, and it's not a big enough sample size to make any claims about any kind of objective power level within the environment, but it at least supports the feeling I had when recording this episode that I think blue-white control is quite good right here and does rely on those board wipes to find success. Back to you, Past Andy, you handsome devil. My feeling is that, I think, Aaron was just wrecking people blue-white control for a long time in this cube, and I think it's actually quite strong, especially by invitation only. I think route has also proved to be quite good here because you can often actually wait long enough to pay it 7 mana for it, and then you get to immediately untap and commit to the board instead of having to, pass the turn and have your opponent be the first one to start deploying threats. Planar Outburst, I think, is pretty lackluster. I will agree with that, actually.
I saw somebody awaken with it the other day, and that was cool.
It can happen, but even in that situation, it's what is it, 8 mana to cast it with Awaken?
It's 8, yeah.
Yeah, even that for 8 mana, I feel not great. And then you just get your land bounce or something, and you're like, all right,
That is what I saw happen, correct?
Yeah, I don't know. That one I think is pretty lackluster. But I do think that, especially by invitation only, and to a slightly lesser degree route, are very strong role players in this cube, and if I picked them early, I would for sure draft differently, knowing I had them in my deck.
Sure, that makes sense. And when you say draft differently, you're trying to draft things, that are just more effective in the late game, or are, generating value that isn't creatures?
I'm going to really highly prioritize ways to generate value that are not creatures, which means that I'm going to take card draw spells more highly. I'm going to take stuff like Maze Mind Tome. Is that in the regular cube, or is that just Turbo Cube? I'm going to take things like Maze Mind Tome really highly. Basically, anything I can do with my mana on the early turns of the game to not just fall way behind on tempo, to actually spend my mana doing something to affect the game state, which also eliminates the whole, I didn't have anything, I'm just playing lands and passing. I have a dumb opening
here's
hand.
My Untethered Express.
Right.
I'll get a 1/1 eventually. Don't worry about it.
You're doing things to commit to the board to, build out your strategy in ways that are not going to be undone by those effects. And then I will plan to be the deck that has the inevitability, right? Which is the other unspoken thing, is that if I'm planning to be able to wipe the board, I also want, if we flip both our decks over and just go to the late game, that I have the most card advantage, the best threats, just like I'm not going to immediately after the board wipe have my opponent play a threat I can't answer and can't deal with or can't just go over the top of. So I think in those terms too, I'm also going to then have my deck full of some powerful stuff that I can do after the board wipe.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're talking about the mana cost, but what about the volume, the number of board wipes? Does that also impact your gameplay in a similar way?
I think so, but if you're open to it, I think we should save the density discussion.
Okay.
I'm going to keep talking about cost. Because I'm curious, how did you feel about the 5 mana board wipes in Justin's Cube, or all the board wipes are starting at 5 mana in Justin's Cube?
I did not actually encounter a lot of board wipes, so I'm not sure I can speak to that in much
I didn't
detail.
See any either.
Which maybe is kind of the effect. They're not necessarily as appealing, because I feel like this cube felt in some ways kind of like the same tempo and power level as the Bun Magic cube, but if those 5 mana wraths are just going to be less appealing, they might just be featured less in games, which maybe is part of Justin's intent there.
Hey gang, it's me back again. I'm about to relay an anecdote from the drafting of Justin's Cube this past weekend, and I just completely got confused. Basically, we played a couple cubes, and I got my wires crossed and was thinking of games from a totally different cube we played, where I played against Justin and had a board wipe in my deck. In my actual draft of Justin's Cube, I did have no board wipes in my deck and never saw any of the drafts. So this anecdote is too tied into the rest of the conversation for me to cut out, but yeah, it's all just completely wrong. So I guess ignore it as much as you can. The jury shall pretend it didn't hear that. All right, here's the wrong story. Well, I will say, I did have, I think, 2 in my pool, and I cited the better one in a couple times. I had this 5 mana one that destroys all creatures and all things attached to creatures, which I think is quite bad, because it's just a 5 mana Wrath of God. It has no other upside. And then I had, what was the one I had that had a little bit of upside on it? I had some other 5 mana Wrath that was more appealing. And I was a creature deck, ostensibly. I was a black-white play creatures to the board sort of deck. But I had a lot of target removal, and then I did bring that board wipe in out of the sideboard, and it worked perfectly fine in the games where I needed it. It was oftentimes like, well, I'm dead here unless I draw my board wipe, right? Which is I think, a place you often find yourself in when you have board wipes in a cube. It's like oftentimes winning are only outs.
That's honestly one of my favorite things about board wipes is they can sometimes make a game just feel more viable. It's like, oh, I want to keep playing this out even though I feel like I'm way behind because I know I do have an answer in my deck somewhere.
Yeah. And I'll say that I don't know how much emphasis should be put on the cost of board wipes. I mean, obviously 4 mana is better than 5 mana. I think I've said for a long time that I think Wrath of God would be totally fine in the regular cube, and I don't think it would change almost anything about the texture of play. Like, it's not like I'm going to draft a totally different deck if I get an early Wrath of God versus an early Rout, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, it is kind of funny that, like, Wrath of God is better the longer you can wait in some ways. Like, if you can really use your life total as a resource
Absolutely.
And your opponent is still committing stuff to the board, you'd love to play it on turn 5 or turn 6. I think where the power level actually comes in, which you sort of mentioned already, is that if you can play your board wipe and then immediately add to the board and actually present another threat, that ends up being pretty powerful.
Yeah, and, you know, with regards to the cost specifically in Justin's cube, Justin includes mana rocks in his cube, which I don't in the Bun Magic cube. And so even though Rafts cost 5 instead of 4, how many times can the control deck just play a mana rock on turn 2 and still get to the board wipe by the same turn? In which case, effectively, those board wipes are actually playing maybe at the same speed, theoretically. Because all of the ramp in the Bun Magic cube, except for a couple exceptions with it, which are enchantments on lands, but they're in green and it's hard to play a board wipe in your green deck anyway. You're not playing ramp and control decks in the Bun Magic cube, is what I'm saying. It pretty much doesn't happen because I don't have mana rocks. The ramp is all creatures or in green.
Yeah, I mean, maybe even more to the sort of mana value, being able to cast the Wrath as late as possible and then still have more mana to do stuff. Actually casting the Wrath and then keeping up more interaction is probably the most powerful thing you can do. You know, I'm going to destroy everything, and if you have another threat, I'm just going to counter it.
Yeah, which is, I think, a pretty common play pattern I'll see in like the Bun Magic cube is, you know, you built your board out, it's turn 4, you've been like beating me down, I'll balance and then hold up counterspell, and then if I don't have to counter whatever you do next turn, I'll untap and play Monastery Mentor with that same counterspell backup, right? Or something like that is a pretty common play pattern for a control deck in the Bun Magic cube. So I guess what I'm saying is, after playing in Justin's cube and thinking about it more, I'm not sure the cost matters as much as maybe I initially thought it did to the power level of board wipes. Especially when you think of the 5 mana board wipes with substantial upside, right? Like, in the Neoclassical cube, I have Rout and Wrath of God, and I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, because that cube does have a lot of mana rocks. There are plenty of decks that can play to get to 7 mana to cast a board wipe. The nature of aggressive decks is also very different. It's more of like a synergy environment and less of like a just curve out and beat you down environment. I mean, there are some decks that do that, but it's a different kind of cube, and so I'm not sure I would necessarily... There are definitely control decks I can imagine in that cube where, based on what I've already taken, I choose Rout over Wrath of God in the packs. Like, I think it's very feasible, which I maybe wouldn't have said before, thinking more about the cost of these cards and how much that mana cost actually matters.
Are there, like, things you really need to disrupt that are only relevant on your opponent's turn that you care about? Like, I'm thinking about in the regular cube, vehicles are a thing you can kill with Rout, which is kind of cool, but in the Neoclassical cube, I don't think there's as much of that kind of thing.
Well, there's more like combo kind of things going on.
Like sneak attack or...
Yeah, well, yeah. It's more like if you can like Rout in response to your opponent.
Ooh, animating all their lands with Kamal.
Animating all lands with Kamal. That
cool.
Genuinely happened. I've seen that happen. It's very real. Also, like, you know, if you're playing a Mind Over Matter combo deck and
That's
they, play out Kamal and are trying to kill you, it's like, you're just going to die right now.
Different Kamal.
Yeah. It's Rout is anti-Kamal tech in all colors. That one's actually kind of tricky because if they have enough cards in hand, they can just untap in response and do it. But there are other things like that where the instant speed is relevant. I do think the main advantage of it, though, is just getting to board wipe on your opponent's end step and then untap and have your whole turn worth of mana to be the first to commit things to the board and get ahead. So, moving out of the 4 mana slot, this is where you get the cheapest true, you know, unconditional hard board wipes, like your Wrath of Gods, your Day of Judgments, your Supreme Verdict, those kinds of things. And I think it's a reasonable spot for these effects to be. I also think that in some ways, my control decks in the Bun Magic cube, I've started prioritizing some of the more conditional board wipes that I have to like set up or, you know, build around or play around that can be much more efficient over just, you know, the hard resets at 4 mana. I mean, it's nice to have one of those maybe, but I do lean more on the balances and the Toxic Deluges and, you know, those sorts of cards, I think, in my best control decks in the Bun Magic cube now. At 3 mana, you do have your soft stuff, the hardest of which I think is like your Toxic Deluge. You also have a ton of the, Drown in Sorrow style effects in black. A lot of things in red that are actually quite good that none of us are on any real red soft board wipes except for Wildfire in the Neoclassical Cube. But
yeah, I had Pyroclasm in for a while, actually. It ended up being a really strong card because there's a lot of cheap creatures that, most people are playing. And so I think that my issue with Pyroclasm was just how easily splashable it was. So people would just be playing, whatever colors, and then here's a random Pyroclasm that's just going to come out of nowhere and kind of ruin your plan.
Oh, I think that's cool. That is the kind of thing I like rewarding. Like inventive splashing, that sounds awesome.
Okay, fine. We're putting it back.
I'm just saying, it's just a note of a difference in our preferences.
Red is not already the most powerful card in this cube.
Well, that's the kind of card that would not make any of the existing red decks better.
Sure.
Because they're all playing a bunch of creatures to the board. That's the kind of card you would splash in like a blue-black deck, and it would be really strong in the right matchups.
I see what you're saying. I would happily put this, well, maybe not. I don't know. I'm thinking about like a blue-red deck. It's like similar. It's like, I have the Pyroclasm. Cool. I'll wait until turn 3 to cast this, and then I'll do my thing.
The thing is, you won't always have it in your opening hand. Sometimes you'll have, a board full of, tokens from Young Pyromancer, and you'll just draw your Pyroclasm and be like, well, cool, I drew a dead
card. They both say Pyro. That's synergy.
I mean, I do think that, like, yes, that could happen, but I think in the average red deck in your cube, you should not put Pyroclasm in and just hope to have it in your opening hand and sandbag it, because if you're at, ahead or parity, worst of all, you're like at parity, and then you draw it and you're like, well, if this was any threat, I would now be ahead. Or if this was a removal spell, I'd be ahead. But instead it's an uncastable board wipe that I guess I just have to hope I fall behind and then I can reset and maybe get lucky top decking. Like, that's just not where you want to be.
I can find a way to fall behind. That's not my issue as a Magic player.
Stepping down to 2-mana wraths, we've talked about things like balance, things like Engineer Explosives as a 2-mana wrath for tokens. These can be, I think, some of the most swingy effects and also are the most conditional. But I think these are ones I would actually be very conscious of including in your cube. Like if I had a cube with a lot of tokens, I don't think I would just throw an Engineer Explosives in there and think it was probably going to be fine, because that has a real potential for like blowouts, which might not be the best feelings in the world. I know we said we wouldn't talk about it, but I do want to mention here that the Hunter Ornithopter's cube has a ton of 2-mana board wipes. I would say 2 mana is like the average cost for a board wipe in that cube. And
there are a lot of weird cards that turns out when all of the creatures are Ornithopters, you can destroy them all.
Or have 2 toughness or are artifacts. Or
yes.
There's a lot of ways in which they are susceptible. And it's interesting that in that cube, the thought of a 3-mana board wipe, it's like, that's probably not good enough. Like, it's probably not really getting there. So you got to be at 2 mana, maybe 3 mana with some upside. We get down to 1-mana board wipes, and I got to acknowledge maybe one of the most controversial inclusions in my cube that I've really come to love, which is Terminus. I have found Terminus, which is, for those that don't know, it's a 6-mana board wipe that puts all creatures in the bottom of their controller's libraries, their owner's libraries, I guess, but it has Miracle for a single white mana. This is the other thing that made me sort of reconsider how important the mana cost of Wraths were, because the jump from 4 to 5 is substantial, in terms of Magic. The difference between a 4-drop and a 5-drop makes a big difference in terms of what turn you can expect to deploy it. 5 to 6, all of a sudden it's like a 6-mana board. Like, you probably wouldn't consider a 6-mana board wipe even viable in the regular cube, and I think you'd for the most part be right.
I've had some in, and they just, never got played.
And yet, I have plenty of times in the Bun Magic cube just cast Terminus for 6. Sometimes you just do it, and it's actually fine. It's still nice to have that effect there, because, it might change the way you play, right? Like, if Terminus is in your opening hand, and you really want to keep your opening hand because of whatever reason, hopefully you've got
Brainstorm in the deck.
Hopefully you've got Brainstorm and Jace in your deck to tuck it eventually. But if you don't get there, then you will probably spend a couple more targeted removal spells early in the game. You might counter a particularly potent creature. You might spend a couple more spells, which means that when you do resolve that board wipe, it won't be quite as huge of a card advantage swing, but it can still be a huge tempo swing in the sense that your opponent will have spent more mana on the threats that you are now removing than you're going to spend on the actual board wipe itself. It's still not... I don't love when people just blind flip the Terminus, right? They did no work to set it up. They just happened to, flip it in the right moment. And I got to say, it's been pretty rare. What's happened much more often is someone will flip Terminus in a situation where it's like, okay, I guess I'll Wrath here. Like, I wasn't playing with a Wrath in mind. I already have a creature on board, or my opponent only has one creature.
It's like, I'll take this free 2-for-1 when I was hoping to get a 6-for-1 from this later on, but
or even just turn it into a free 1-for-1. Like, all right, you got one creature, and I top deck Terminus. Great. Put your Mana Dork on the bottom, and this is just a removal spell that I drew now. That happens pretty often, and I'm totally okay with that. Once or twice, I've seen somebody be like, well, I've done no work to set it up, but true pray for a miracle, hope the top of my deck is Terminus, and in fact it is. Though it's worth noting, in a lot of those situations, I think you will also just have 6 mana. And so obviously you're way better off miracling, because then you can also hold up counterspells or play a threat immediately afterwards. But if you were going to be able to cast it anyway, it's not hugely swingy. Anyway, I have enough ways to set it up with Jace, with Brainstorm, with Preordain, Ponder, that kind of stuff, as well as Sensei's Divining Top, which is maybe the classic thing to pair it with. Got all those things going on there. I've got, some of my favorite control decks will have a Sensei's Divining Top Urza's Saga package, which then means that your Urza Saga is both threats and also can be something that finds your top, which makes you more likely to be able to set up your Terminus. There's a lot of little cool, interesting strategies, and I think making a control deck that can really make Terminus great is part of the fun in this cube in terms of drafting a control deck. Let's get to densities. It seemed like you've been looking at the regular cube. Did you also count a total of 6 board wipes, 3 hard board wipes, 3 soft board wipes, plus the weirdo eliminate the competition in there for the honorary 7th position?
Those are the exact numbers that I have tabulated in my head.
I mean, we've mentioned pretty much all the cards at this point. By invitation only, Planar Outburst and Rout are your hard board wipes. Drown in Sorrow, Witch's Vengeance, and Plague Spitter are your soft board wipes by my eye. And then eliminate the competition is a question mark. It's also worth noting your cube is larger than 360 cards, so on average you're probably only opening 4 or 5 of these in a given draft. Are you happy with the density of the board wipes in this cube? Do you feel like it's the right amount right now, or do you feel like there's some edge to be gained there from a cube design perspective?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that if I changed it drastically, it would change the environment drastically, and I don't think it would necessarily be better or worse. It would just be different. And like you were describing, right now this is an environment where it's pretty reasonable to just curve out and commit your resources to the board. And I could totally see the argument. Somebody could say to me, that's not the kind of gameplay I like. It's not that much tension. There's a lot of tension in other aspects of the game, but yeah, in terms of sequencing, it's just about how do you use your resources efficiently. So I would not hate the idea of saying let's triple it and just see how things go. But I also don't think that's, I don't know. I would do that if it really appealed to me, but also maybe I want to just make dumplings today.
Yeah, in general, you're just satisfied with the cube.
It's a perfect cube. That's what I'm trying to say here.
Not worried about overthinking it, which is respectable. I imagine you probably have not looked in detail at the Bun Magic Cube. Do you want to hazard a guess at how many board wipes are in the Bun Magic Cube?
I'm going to guess
to your 6 in regular.
A lot more. Okay, I do have the list up, but I'm going to not look at it. Let's guess 4 hard in white, 2 hard in black, and 2 more soft, and let's say 3 soft in red.
So
do you cast
13, I think, is what you...
Yeah. Do you count Thing in the Ice as a board wipe?
I did count Thing in the Ice as a soft board wipe.
Thing in the Ice. How'd I do? No, there's got to be some other blue ones, but...
There are no other blue ones.
Okay.
I counted 10 total.
10.
There are 3 hard ones in white, including Supreme Verdict, and then Damnation in black. And then there's Balance, Toxic Deluge, Demonic Massacre, Harvester of Misery, Engineered Explosives, Thing in the Ice. I even said earlier in this episode, none of us play any board wipes in red. I don't either. Got nothing in there that resembles a board wipe. I have, over the years, had many cards in and out of there. I've had Anger of the Gods, I've had Pyroclasm, I've had Wildfire in and out, but currently I'm on none of those and have been happy with that density. Kind of double, I would say, what you have in the regular cube, given the fact that the regular cube is a little larger. I have spent a lot of time thinking about the density of board wipes, and it's worth noting that, I pretty much only think about them in terms of white and black control decks. And in the Bun Magic Cube, you have to be playing blue as well. So you're either a blue-white control deck, a blue-black control deck, or an Esper control deck, or, a Jeskai control deck can happen occasionally too. And I want those decks to have access to, in most drafts, 3 board wipe effects if they prioritize and take them. And I found that by putting 4 in white, 1 in colorless, and then 4 in black. Having those distributions has meant that if you're the control player at the table, you can get around 3. And I find that 3 is a good number in a deck that has a lot of card selection and card advantage to reliably find 1 in a game if you need to. So I think I'm pretty happy with the board wipe density where things are at. Thing in the Ice is a little funny that it's a board wipe that also puts a huge spend into play. But it does bounce all your own stuff too, except for the Thing in the Ice.
Unless they're horrors.
I don't think there are any other horrors in this cube.
Okay.
Maybe there are. I've never seen that happen if there are other horrors.
I would not be surprised if it was just missed, if it did.
What do you think about the Neoclassical Cube? How many board wipes do you think are there?
Ooh, I mean, There you've got a lot of the old classics. So let's guess. I think you do have Route, you do have Wrath of God. So let's say 4 in white, and black actually had fewer in old school vibes. Like Damnation was kind of a weird correction on shouldn't black have always been the color that did this?
Right.
So I'm gonna guess maybe only 2 in black, and then what else? You do have some pyroclasm type effects. Let's say 3 or 4 in red. No?
I also have 10 total here.
Okay.
Wrath of God, Route, Balance, Planar Collapse in white.
Okay, so more.
Planar Collapse and Balance being soft there. In black, I do have Decree of Pain and Living Death, which are both soft board wipes, but board wipes nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have Wildfire in red. It's the only red card that's a board wipe.
Really?
Yep.
Okay.
Powder Keg is the engineered explosives of the day for the Neoclassical Cube. And then what I want to talk about briefly is Pernicious Deed, which...
Right, I was looking at that earlier.
I actually counted that as a hard board wipe because in my experience, that is what Pernicious Deed does every time. And unlike something like Medoc Massacre, it does by definition allow you to destroy things on curve, right? Like your opponent just curves out and plays, a 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. You play Pernicious Deed on 3, you untap with 4 mana on turn 4, and you can blow up everything that is on the board. A really strong one, and I think given that it's in a weird color combination for that effect, it does funny things to deck building in a way that I'm very happy with in that cube environment. I think it does kind of weird, fun things there. And then Humility's floating around, which would be the 11th board wipe if you count it.
Right.
And I think I do count it.
That's a weirdo.
It's a weirdo. It's a weirdo confirmed, but it's a weirdo I'm going to count just because I do think of it as a control card, and I think it has a lot of similar considerations when you are drafting and building around it. I'm going to end here just talking about concretely, and we've touched on a lot of this already, how board wipes affect the play patterns of an environment. And the first one is just strongly incentivizing creature light control decks. These are, honestly, I was thinking about it, like some of the only symmetrical effects that pop up and are considered like a part of bread and butter magic, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's
like other symmetrical effects are like taxing effects, which, Thalia kind of gets a pass for just being good on rate and not being too swingy. But I don't think you see most people considering like Winter Orb and Tangle Wire and like those kinds of things to be part of like normal magic. I think it's considered like a deviation from bread and butter magic. Same goes for things like, Mana Flare. Like that's just a weird combo card. It's not actually something you play in like a fair way. And so I think board wipes to me are it's hard for me to imagine ever designing a cube without something like a board wipe because of how much I love making players recontextualize their draft and forcing them to try and break symmetry on a card to get a huge power level benefit out of it. And the fact that these cards can be the best cards in the cube and the best cards in given situations, but you can't just drop them in any deck that has the right color mana to cast them, I think is a huge boon to the variety of drafting and deck building.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like for my own cube design context, and maybe I should have given this context at the beginning, I don't necessarily have the same strong feelings about board wipes. Like I don't necessarily think that they are an essential sauce. Great.
I mean, you cited the regular cube as something you were inspired by Retail Limited. Retail Limited, I would say, board wipes are not a factor. And they are always at rare or above, and you can never afford to play around them unless you've already seen them.
Absolutely, and that's sort of what I wanted to cite was a lot of the Magic that I've played is Retail Limited, and that's what I really enjoy and what I really wanted to, it's not a perfect emulation, but I wanted to channel a lot of that spirit in my primary cube. So I think that's a big reason why. But another part of my Magic history is playing Commander, and I really did not love the way that board wipes played out in that format in multiplayer.
Just making the game an hour longer?
Yeah, I mean, I kept building these decks that are like, oh, I'm going to build up all these creatures and have this engine, and then somebody casts a board wipe, and it's like, okay, I guess I start doing that again, and then somebody else casts a board wipe, and it's like, okay, I guess I do that a third time. And I know that I
Fool me thrice.
I should have
Guess I'll step on this rake again.
More adaptable and been like, okay, well, I'm going to build decks that have more, diverse ways to apply pressure and win the game. But I didn't want to, so instead I just started playing Limited and didn't play that much Commander anymore.
That's part of the fundamental tension of, I think, our relationship to Commander is that we really resisted just optimizing for what the format wanted us to do, and instead kept trying to make it what we wanted it to be. And ultimately,
that's what Cube is.
And ultimately, that's what led us to stop playing Commander. Is like, okay, well, we keep trying to play our kind of magic over here, and we just keep stepping on rakes. People just keep laying rakes down. So off to Cube it is.
So yeah, I mean, for me, I can't imagine designing a cube without board wipes. And honestly, I'm not totally sure why when I designed the regular cube, I did decide to still include a couple. I think that they were maybe even more at 6 mana, and I've brought that down a little bit.
But you had like the 6 mana board wipe I remember from the early days of the regular cube was Find Finality, which...
That took a while for people to notice was a problem.
You say that. I remember just being great from the beginning, but
okay, maybe it was.
It's all memories. Who's to say? But that's a card that, is kind of like somewhat asymmetrical because you get to save one creature on your side of the board almost all the time. And if you are playing a green deck in that cube, oftentimes maybe a couple creatures survive and you just destroy your opponent handily.
Yeah.
So that's a 6 mana board wipe that I think would, if you were to put it back in, even though the cube is probably more powerful now than it was back then, still be very dominant.
Definitely. And the modality, because it's a split card where you can also just use it as a double regrowth.
What the heck is Find again? Is it
you get back to either 2 creatures or 2 permanents. I think 2 creatures.
It's a double regrowth?
I'm pretty sure.
That's so strong.
It was a good card. I could be wrong. Don't quote me. Or rather, quote me. Engage.
Engage! So that's, I think, the first thing that board wipes do to an environment is they, I think, are some of the highest EV cards in terms of the effect they can have on your draft for like the amount of space they take up in a cube. I mean, ultimately, I have 10, you have 6, but they have a huge impact on the way people draft because they make whole kinds of decks viable that otherwise would really struggle. So I really like them for that reason. The next major play pattern that comes to mind for board wipes for me is that they just keep things from getting too out of control. I don't love a big board stall. I don't love 2 decks just like...
You know what's better than nobody being able to attack because there's too many creatures? Nobody being able to attack because there are no creatures.
I mean, in that world, I absolutely think the second, like having no creatures is such a better game state because at least when I draw another creature...
Do you sit down at a game of Magic and look at the empty battlefield and just think, it's all downhill from here?
No, it's all potential. It's an empty canvas ready to be painted on. Whereas a board where everybody's got 12 blockers in play is like, okay, I play another creature, but it doesn't matter. I'm 95% sure, but let me do a counting for the next 5 minutes to see if somehow...
Okay, now it's your turn to count. Now I'll go back to my counting when you count.
Yeah, boy. That's
Love
just
it.
like honestly, like obviously neither of those board states is like appealing. I don't want games to be completely empty on the board for multiple turns versus completely clogged on the board for multiple turns. But given the 2 options, I'm always leaning towards completely empty for multiple turns. That is so much more appealing to me. So that's a genuine reason I am drawn to them, is because I don't mind hard resets and just keeping the number of game pieces that both players have to track under control, and certainly having more cards that remove a lot of game pieces will lead to that pattern. I think the biggest impact of board wipes, though, from a player perspective, is also maybe one of their biggest contributions to an environment, which is that they discourage players from overcommitting to the board. Playing around board wipes is something that you should do in a cube that has a high enough density of them. You absolutely should in the Bun Magic cube. You should plan to play around them. I was paired against Justin with my deck that I brought a board wipe in out of the sideboard of, and he played around it and won the game because of it. And had he not played around it, he absolutely would have lost. And I think that if you roll the dice on the starting deck order and what your opening hand looks like and emulate how a bunch of games play out, in those games where one player is heavily advantaged, I think it's so much more interesting to ask that player to win by just enough, right? Like, you're ahead, you are trying to win, but you shouldn't just continue to snowball that advantage and not think about it and just commit to the board. You should be still, even though you're in a heavily advantaged position, asking yourself, how much do I actually need to win versus how much can I afford to hold back in case something goes wrong, in case there's a board wipe. And similarly, you mentioned this on the other side of the battlefield, being the player who's way behind and knowing you have board wipes in your deck makes that game so much more tolerable. And the environments I've played with very low density of board wipes, and I'm primarily thinking about rarity-restricted environments here. I think this is one of the biggest things that happens when you go down to Peasant or Pauper, is that you just lose whole card types, and board wipes are one of the biggest ones you lose. And in those environments, I find that, if the cards just fall a certain way and one player just kind of snowballs an advantage, then it's kind of just over, right? And you have to play it to its conclusion. Maybe you get super lucky and, draw running removal spells and your opponent just gets flooded, but there's so little opportunity for like a big swing in the game that if you're ahead, you're just supposed to keep playing threats to the board and just keep jamming, and there's no real thought to that. And if you're behind, you just kind of feel bad and, hope that something good happens to bring you out of it. I think board wipes make both sides of that equation so much better. I want the player who's way ahead to still be thinking about what could go wrong and planning for it, and I want the player that's behind to have more outs in their deck and more live draws in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it is interesting how it affects both players in different ways and keeps them engaged in the game in a new way.
Can we try and summarize this a little bit, this whole conversation? I mean, like, I think I want this to be a helpful takeaway for people that are designing their own cubes. And I know we've said a lot. I don't know how much of it is applicable to people.
All right, point 1. Cards are difficult to categorize. Don't be too pedantic about it.
That's evergreen point. Evergreen statement.
Point 2. Andy thinks board wipes are great and important, and there should be lots of them. Because
I wouldn't say that's the second point.
Because they make games more engaging, because players that are ahead still need to be mindful of ways they could lose the game, and players that are behind still have ways to recoup that disadvantage.
And what I would say is, it's not important to you.
Recoup the advantage.
Whatever.
Double negative.
It's not important to you, the listener, what I value, but I will say that if you are finding that in your own cubes, the games are kind of snowbally and people feel like there's no hope for them to come back, or you're finding that the boards are really huge and unmanageable a lot, then those are things that are solved by board wipes. And if, on the flip side, you are a person that really loves those big complicated boards and you kind of like the occasional blowout game where someone just snowballs to a big lead and their opponent can't come back from it, then you should probably run less board wipes, right? Like, this is a design tool, not a mandate for what kinds of games you should like as a listener.
Yeah, that's always important to keep in mind, is everybody's fun is their own, but there are objective things that happen with, what the cards do.
The cards do things, regardless of how you feel about them.
Great point.
One of my takeaways, honestly, is that I think the hyperfixation on the mana value of board wipes is maybe a little overblown. And you can probably look at a little more expensive or a little cheaper board wipes given your desired power level without actually changing the texture of their play patterns much.
I'm not aware of this hyperfixation, but I'll trust you that it's out there.
I guess the last takeaway for me is that even at high density, I would say the Bun Magic Cube probably has a higher density of board wipes than most Eternal cubes. And I'm only on 10 out of 360. I think the regular cube has a pretty typical amount of board wipes, just like gut feeling, and you're on 4 or 5 out of the equivalent 366, but you're on a bigger cube. I think it's interesting that I ended up with exactly the same number of board wipes of the Neoclassical and Bun Magic Cube without ever counting them or looking at it. Like, I never gave that any particular thought, but landed on both of those after a bunch of play testing and tuning. So that feels like it's maybe the right-ish number for my play priorities and play preferences. But I think density-wise, these are some of the cards that go the furthest in terms of their impact on the meta, the environment, for the fewest number of card inclusions.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
I guess the last takeaway, too, is that if you think that breaking symmetry on symmetrical effects and forcing players to kind of twist their strategy to benefit from something that otherwise is completely undiscerning in who it affects, I think board wipes are by far the easiest way into that kind of magic. I mean, I also have a bunch of taxing stuff in the Neoclassical Cube. I enjoy playing that kind of magic sometimes, and you get a lot of that same rush of trying to build a deck that's really good under Winter Orb or trying to build a deck that's really good under Sphere of Resistance. But that's definitely a lot less accessible to people. Board wipes are probably the most popular and well-known types of cards that are considered a part of normal bread and butter magic. And pretty much every set printed has some board wipes in it. They aren't rare, so they're not really huge factors in retail limited, but they're pretty much always there. And they allow your players to access this break parity on this effect and make it really powerful. Whereas, as printed, it is completely fair, doesn't necessarily benefit you at all. Make a deck board that can actually benefit you, which I really like.
Maybe my next cube. Turn it up to 12.
As in 12 board wipes?
No, I meant just a lot. It's more than 11.
I haven't done the count. I think there are a ton in Ornithopters. I would not be surprised if there were 24 in Ornithopters. And that definitely has an effect on how that environment plays out, which is to say that most strategies that require 4 turns to win struggle, because in that 4 turns, it's entirely likely your opponent's going to reset the board at some point. And so the strategies that can win in a turn or 2, I think, are heavily advantaged.
Yeah, and you've mentioned that you've said that the meta has shifted a little bit, and maybe my way of drafting it is not as effective anymore, and I think that's probably a big contributor.
I mean, who knows? Maybe it is. It's possible.
It's been a while since I've drafted that cube.
But I think you've said multiple times after you 3-0'd, you're like, I'm glad nobody had any board wipes. And I'm like, there are 20 here. How did you run into none of them? But
sometimes you just gotta get lucky.
Sometimes you gotta roll good.
Okay, I don't have any board wipes in this list yet.
Was this a mystery new cube project that you've been teasing?
New cube. I don't know if it's ever going to be a real thing. It's very silly.
I'm going to go count the board wipes in the Sacred Geometry right now and see if it's around the same number. And if it's not, I'll probably try and make it around 10, just because I've learned from experience that that's kind of what I want in a like non-clown shoes environment.
Okay, I got 4 here.
Can't wait to find out what this cube is
and I'm
in
only at,
6 months.
I'm only at 160 cards, so.
Great. On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. If you're listening to this the day it comes out or shortly after, this is your absolute last chance to get in hot takes for Foundations. Also your last chance to fill out our survey, so check them out in the comments. We also keep updating our events page with more events, so make sure you check out luckypaper.co/events. That will also be linked in the comments. What else do you want to tell people about, Anthony?
You're on Blue Sky now.
I was going to save that for... We'll mention it now, but I also want to talk about it when we have Parker on the show. But yeah.
Oh, sure.
We're all on Blue Sky now. I signed up for a new social media network, which I thought I would never, ever do ever again. But
crazy.
You know, Twitter just got real bad. And so far, I have been impressed with Blue Sky. I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I'm still very cynical in the sense that I don't know how they're making money. And eventually, they got to figure out somehow to turn a profit. And it's probably going to get all messed up then. But for now, it's good. It kind of feels like the early days of Twitter in a way that is very nice. So if you are interested in magic social media... We literally probably never mentioned our Twitter on the show before.
No, I don't think so.
Because I only kind of superficially, I use it kind of at a sense of weird obligation where it's like, well, I feel like we need to have a presence in this town square, but I had very little to actually say over there, and Blue Sky feels a little different. Partially because I'm actually under my own name and face there, which for a long time it was just Lucky Paper on Twitter, which felt like a sort of front for the brand. But Blue Sky is this cool feature where you can actually turn any domain into your handle, which is, it's so brilliant in terms of verification. Like Twitter has the whole dumb blue check nonsense to verify you are who you are. And this is no, you have access to this domain, you get to have that handle, which is also a great way to keep people from squatting on a handle that they then will sell to Pepsi or whatever for, $10,000 because only Pepsi can get Pepsi.com as their handle. Anyway, I think it's a brilliant feature. And so on there, I'm Andy.luckypaper.co, Anthony's Anthony.luckypaper.co, Parker's Parker.luckypaper.co. We're going to mention it again probably when we have Parker on next week to do the Foundation's set review, which I think will be next week. Should be.
I'm probably just going to post stuff that I cook. But
post noodles.
I'm going to post noodles.
I'm posting every cube deck I ever draft on there, as well as musings about life.
Musings.
And this one dream I had where I was making this big, beautiful, delicious soup, and it was so good. There were so many steps of boiling down this broth to thicken it and then adding this other ingredient. But every time I did a step, I kept spilling some or losing some soup. And it started this big giant pot, and it got down to the very end, and I had a little bit left, and I was like, oh boy. And the last step, I just poured it into a strainer that was inside of another strainer on the stove, and it went all over the stove, and I lost all my soup. Dream over.
That's so sad.
It was very sad.
I'm sorry you lost all your soup.
And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about magic cards and speaking to microphones about it. If we got any card text wrong in this episode, that was intentional to bait engagement, so don't you dare fall for it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for telling me about your very sad dream and how much you love rats.